So my topic, and the topic of the first book, is the impact of the market on moral education, character formation, and the transportation of values. Markets provide opportunities for trading goods, services, and assets, opportunities for the pursuit of private economic interests under conditions of competition with other interests, and opportunities for serving other people by catering to their needs and to their desires. Competitive markets decentralize societies, and competitive markets diffuse power. Market systems presuppose private property and the ability and freedom of individuals to enter into contracts with others. Property rights and the validity of contracts, in turn, must be guaranteed by the government which also regulates the scope of the market system, what can and what cannot be traded on markets, and which regulates the depth of markets, what kind of contracts can be concluded and enforced. And the government also has a role in upholding a sufficiently strong degree of competition. And therefore, there's no such thing as a free market. Markets are always in the context of law and government. Now, there's a long tradition in the Western world of thinking about the moral consequences of a market system. On the one hand, this tradition has focused on questions of the kind of personal values and virtues that are thought to be promoted by trading on markets. On the other hand, there's a debate about whether or not markets promote social justice. And both strands of the debate are also reflected in biblical texts. The project, the consultation, and the book cover both biblical material and modern debates on these issues. So let me start with personal values and virtues. Regarding these, we find two antagonistic views laid out in the first chapter of the book. On the one hand, there is the claim that markets and trading on markets promote the virtues necessary for a civilized bourgeois society: honesty, prudence, industry, peace, diligence. And since the time of the Enlightenment, this has been known as the do commerce hypothesis, so friendly market hypothesis, a term that goes back at least to Montesquieu. On the other hand, there's the claim that markets and trading on markets promote the worst moral traits in human beings: greed, deception, selfishness. In the book, this is dubbed the markets make villain hypothesis. In one version of this argument, it is said that market systems reward rational and utility or profit-maximizing behavior, and that such behavior has replaced traditional concepts of virtue and the pursuit of the common good, which, as a result, have lost their power in guiding individual moral behavior. So, what is the evidence supporting one or the other of these two hypotheses? Several chapters in the book pursue this question. John Whitty presents 4 examples of early Protestant household manuals that laid out in considerable detail the moral and religious rules, rights, and responsibilities of family members towards each other and towards their fellow citizens. These manuals shaped the norms and habits of Protestant households, and in doing so, they laid the ground for good individual behavior in the market system. Stephen Pickard, who unfortunately cannot be with us today, Stephen Pickard presents a similar perspective on the compatibility of market behavior and the Christian faith. Stephen argues that rational economic behavior, including profit and utility maximizing, has its place in the economy of God. And of course, this is a great consolation for an economist because Stephen explicitly discusses that terrible person called Homo economicus, that cold, rational, grim person who always pursues nothing but his own interest. And Stephen says there's even a place for that person in the household of God. Ginny Choi and Virgil Storr consider a range of studies on the performance of the populations of countries characterized by different degrees of market orientation, performance along several moral dimensions such as altruism, honesty, and loyalty. They find that more market-oriented societies certainly do not fare worse in these dimensions than less market-oriented ones. Jason Brennan summarizes existing microeconomic evidence as saying that market systems do not seem to corrupt morals. So on balance, it seems like there is more support for the do-commerce hypothesis than for the markets make villains hypothesis. Importantly, however, evaluating the moral impact of market systems is not enough. One must also consider the moral impact of alternative economic systems such as socialism and government command control economies that give more power to individuals or bureaucracies than markets. Even if one finds that markets have some adverse moral effects, it is quite possible that the moral effects of alternative systems would be even worse. So there's room for more work on these topics. In market economies, concepts of moral value can also be related to private business and enterprise. Manfred Lautenschläger emphasizes the importance of interdisciplinary research in this regard, arguing that combining economics, theology, and philosophy is necessary, and again pointing to room for more research. Pete Naudet reviews the evolution of value concepts in business literature from individual shareholder value, which was connected to Milton Friedman's views, to shared value, stakeholder value, and finally, collective value. And so each of these stages implies a broadening of the economic and moral valuation of business activities of all those involved in business, namely owners, then employees, then customers, and finally society at large. Ethical education of business managers becomes increasingly important as the value concept becomes more inclusive. Michael Welker presents the results of empirical research into the relationship between religious beliefs on the one hand and business practices on the other hand in a sample of Asian business owners and business managers. He shows that religious beliefs shape the way how these individuals regard themselves, but religious beliefs seem to have little impact on their actual business practices. And in line with that, Klaus Leisinger warns that ethical considerations in business must not be limited to nice talk. To create real moral value, concrete action is required. Two chapters in the book, one by Catherine Gulden-Lemaire and the other by William Schweiker, discuss the constraints modern information technologies and internet-based markets create for character formation. Catherine warns us that too much exposure to information technologies can have adverse brain formation effects, while William warns us that in an economy where human attention has become a scarce commodity and businesses compete for human attention, people might lose sight of the importance of moral values. Let me then come to the other area of debate, which is social justice. Several chapters in the book treat social justice from a variety of theological perspectives. Michael Boyd studies the evolution of the Torah laws of charity in Jewish communities over time. Michael shows that the interpretation of charity changed from an obligation of helping the poor and weak members of society to an obligation to support institutions that promote the common good, such as institutions for education. In the chapter of Old Testament ethics, I argue that there are four fundamental economic issues covered by Old Testament ethics, namely work, property, exchange, and support for the poor. And these four issues reflect two main ethical principles, namely that humans ought to be stewards of creation, and humans ought to live together in charitable relationships. Katja Wieczorek argues that the Gospel of Luke, with its many economic motives, can be read as a critique of the economic and social injustices of society under the Roman Empire. Luke calls on believers to strengthen solidarity. In a similar spirit, Peter Lampe proposes an understanding of the book of Revelation as a protest against the misery and suffering of the lower classes under the Roman Empire. It is not clear, however, from these readings of the biblical texts whether markets aggravate or alleviate social injustices. If practicing biblical ethics requires a minimum degree of personal and economic freedom, one might well argue that market systems provide more room for this than centralized command and control economies. The implicit preference of biblical texts for economic decentralization, as exemplified by the stark contrast between Egypt with her oppressive slave economy based on the Nile on the one hand, and the land of Canaan with its many hills and valleys and small rivers flowing from the mountains on the other hand, provides more than a hint in that direction. Samuel Gregg traces the development of some key economic concepts like competition, price formation, and the charging of interest in early modern scholastic writing. The growth and spreading of markets and commercial activity during the Middle Ages created new ethical problems of social justice or injustice that needed to be addressed in order to make the new forms of trade and lending compatible with Christian ethical principles, to provide guidance for traders and bankers, and, not the least, to relieve the consciences of traders and bankers, to relieve their consciences of moral torment. The schoolmen did not write as economists, but their writings show a very sophisticated understanding of the economic issues involved. Markets are pervasive in modern societies. There are very few, if any, areas of social life which are isolated from market activities. It is no wonder, therefore, that markets play an important role in the communication, transmission, and practice of ethics. Our consultation and this book provides a wide range of perspectives and arguments showing how the market shapes the human character, ethical understanding, and the communication of values. In a way, the book maybe raises more questions than it provides answers, but it does provide rich food for thought and a good basis for future work and analysis. Thank you very much.